A desperate single mother gives her last warm meal to a grieving stranger, unaware he is the city's most powerful CEO. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises. The words echoed in the sterile silence of the hallway, each one a hammer blow against the fragile shield of Alara's composure. The rain hammered down on the thin windowpane of her small apartment, a relentless and wild drumming that seemed to mock the quiet devastation unfolding within. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the threadbare armchair and the worn rug for a split second before darkness swallowed them whole, leaving only the ghost of a home that was no longer hers. She stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the cool wood of the doorframe, her posture a study in dignified defeat. Her heart thudded a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She was alone. The landlord, a man with a face like crumpled parchment and eyes that held no warmth, merely shrugged, the gesture a final, dismissive punctuation mark to her shattered life. He did not see the pale, trembling woman before him. He saw only an obstacle, a line item in a ledger that had fallen into the red. He didn't see the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand or the hollow look in her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unspeakable loss. He saw only the inconvenience of her poverty, the untidiness of her grief. He turned and his footsteps receded down the hall, each one a nail in the coffin of her stability. She had pleaded, explained, offered promises she knew were as empty as her pockets, but his heart was a fortress of polished indifference. He was a man who dealt in numbers, not in narratives of suffering. Total silence. Inside the small room, the air was thick with the scent of rain and despair. Alara's gaze drifted to the small cradle in the corner, a sanctuary of innocence in a world that had proven to be relentlessly cruel. Her son, Leo, slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, trusting rhythm. A soft, golden glow from a single, flickering lamp cast long shadows across the room, catching the glisten of a tear that finally escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She didn't make a sound, her sorrow a deep, silent ocean threatening to pull her under. Her breath hitched. She had lost her husband, Mark, a firefighter with a hero's heart, only 8 months ago. She had lost her job as a graphic designer shortly after, her grief making her unreliable, her focus shattered. And now she was losing her home. Each loss was a brick torn from the foundation of her world, and she felt the entire structure beginning to crumble around her. She looked at her son, his face so serene, so utterly unaware of the storm raging both outside the window and inside his mother's heart. A wave of fierce, protective love washed over her, a current strong enough to fight the tide of despair. She would not let him see her break. She would be his rock even if she felt like sand. She moved with a quiet resolve that belied the panic clawing at her throat. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as she began to pack their few belongings into a single, worn suitcase. A small, hand-knitted blanket, Mark's favorite photograph, a tiny stuffed bear with one button eye. Each object was a sacred relic, a fragment of a life that felt like a distant dream. The biting cold of the room seeped into her bones, a physical manifestation of the icy fear that had taken root in her soul. She pulled a thin, threadbare sweater around her shoulders, the fabric offering little warmth but a sliver of comfort. She checked her purse. A few crumpled bills and a handful of coins. Enough for a warm bottle for Leo and perhaps a cup of tea for herself. It was not a plan. It was a prayer whispered into the void. She had nowhere to go, no one to call. Her parents were gone, and Mark's mother, Mrs. Albright, had become a stranger to her, her grief curdling into a bitter resentment that blamed Alara for her son's death. The world had shrunk to this one tiny room, and now even that was being ripped away. She zipped the suitcase. The sound was final. The soft click of the lock echoed the closing of a chapter, the end of a life she had once known. She gently lifted Leo from his cradle, wrapping him in the hand-knitted blanket, his small, warm body a precious anchor in the swirling chaos. He stirred, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and snuggled deeper against her chest. Her heart clenched. For him, she would walk through fire. For him, she would face the storm. She took a deep breath. She stepped out of the apartment and did not look back. The pounding rain greeted her like a physical blow, instantly soaking her thin sweater and plastering her dark hair to her face. The city lights blurred into long, weeping streaks of neon, a kaleidoscope of indifference. Alara held Leo tighter, her body curving around him to shield him from the worst of the downpour. The cheap umbrella she'd grabbed, a relic from a lost and found, was no match for the wind, its spokes threatening to buckle with every gust. She hurried down the street, her destination a vague notion of a 24-hour cafe where she could regroup, warm Leo's bottle, and try to quiet the screaming panic in her mind. Every passing car sent a spray of icy water splashing at her ankles, each one a small, personal insult from a world that had turned its back on her. The sounds of the city, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the distant wail of a siren, the low rumble of thunder, all blended into a symphony of urban loneliness. She felt invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that was moving on without her. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but her eyes held a steady, unwavering light. It was the light of a mother's love. It was all she had left. She was just a few blocks from the cafe when she saw him. He was standing on the corner, motionless, without a coat or an umbrella, letting the torrential rain plaster his impeccable suit to his frame. He was like a statue carved from grief, his handsome face a mask of such profound, raw agony that it made her own sorrowful heart ache in recognition. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were hollow, fixed on something far away, something no one else could see. He seemed utterly oblivious to the storm, to the cold, to the world itself. He was drowning on dry land. Alara faltered, her own desperate journey momentarily forgotten. She saw in his haunted gaze a reflection of her own shattered soul. For a moment, she considered just walking past. She had her own storm to weather, her own child to protect. What could she possibly offer this stranger? A man who looked as though he had the world at his feet yet had lost his very soul. The thought was a flicker of self-preservation, a logical impulse in a world that had taught her to be guarded. But then she looked at his face again, at the way his broad shoulders slumped, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She saw the unbearable weight he was carrying. Her inherent goodness, the pure, selfless core of her being that not even tragedy could erode, surged forward. She had just spent her last few dollars at a small convenience store. In one hand, she held a bag containing a freshly warmed bottle of milk for Leo. In the other, she clutched a steaming cup of tea, the warmth a small, precious comfort she had bought for herself. It was her only luxury, her only defense against the biting cold. She looked from the warm cup in her hand to the broken man in the rain. The internal hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. It was a choice between her own small comfort and the possibility of offering a flicker of warmth to another human being in pain. For Alara, it was no choice at all. With a quiet resolve, she walked towards him, her worn shoes squelching on the pavement. She stopped in front of him, holding her flimsy, struggling umbrella over his head. He didn't seem to notice at first, his gaze still lost in that terrible private distance. "Sir?" she said, her voice soft but clear over the drumming of the rain. "You'll catch your death out here." He blinked slowly, his focus returning to the present with a visible effort. His gaze dropped to her face, and for a second, he seemed utterly confused, as if he couldn't comprehend her presence. His eyes, up close, were even more devastating, filled with a shattered, desolate emptiness. "Here," she said, extending the steaming cup of tea towards him. "You look like you need this more than I do." Julian Thorne froze. The world, which had been a muted, gray blur of meaningless shapes and sounds for the past year, suddenly snapped into sharp, painful focus. The sensation was so abrupt it was like being struck. He saw the pale, earnest face of the woman before him, rain dripping from her dark hair. He saw the genuine, unreserved concern in her sincere eyes. He saw the small, precious offering of the warm cup, her own hands trembling slightly from the cold. He registered the baby bundled against her chest, a small, peaceful lump wrapped in a faded blanket. His mind, a fortress of logic and command, simply stopped. In his world, everything was a transaction. Kindness was a currency, a means to an end. People were polite to him because of his name, his power, his wealth. No one had shown him a moment of pure, unadulterated, selfless kindness since Amelia. A seismic shock went through him. He stared at the cup as if it were a strange and holy artifact. A sob, raw and unexpected, caught in his throat, and he had to clench his jaw to keep it from escaping. He had been standing on this corner, the very spot where the accident had happened 1 year ago to the day, trying to feel something, anything, other than the crushing, sterile silence that had become his life. He had been willing the pain to consume him, to burn away the numbness. And then this woman, this stranger with nothing, who was clearly suffering her own battle against the elements, had offered him her only warmth. It was an act so pure, so unexpected, it felt like a miracle. It was a single, gentle light in the unending darkness of his grief. His heart, a block of ice for 12 long months, felt a tiny, painful crack. I can't, he finally managed to say, his voice a rough and used thing. Please, she insisted, her smile gentle and sad. My son is warm. That's all that matters. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world. She pushed the cup into his hand. His fingers, cold and numb, brushed against hers. The contact was brief, electric. He felt the warmth of the cup seep into his frozen skin, a sensation so foreign and so welcome that his eyes glistened with unspoken tears. He didn't know what to say. The words "thank you" felt laughably inadequate. He wanted to ask her name, to ask her story, to understand how someone with so little could give so much. But the words wouldn't form. He could only stare at her, this angel in the storm, a feeling of profound awe washing over him. She gave him another small, encouraging smile. Stay safe, she said softly. And with that, she adjusted the bundle in her arms, turned, and walked away, disappearing into the swirling rain and the city's indifferent glow. He watched her go, the flimsy umbrella bobbing until it was swallowed by the gloom. He was left standing on the corner, the rain still pouring down, clutching a simple paper cup of tea. It was the most valuable thing he had ever held. She was gone. The immediate consequence of Alara's kindness was a deep, shuddering chill that had nothing to do with her renewed soaking. As she hurried the final block to the 24-hour cafe, the warmth from her brief act of charity was replaced by the harsh reality of her situation. The rain, which she had momentarily shielded the stranger from, now seemed to attack her with renewed vigor, seeping through her thin sweater and chilling her to the bone. Leo, sensing his mother's distress and the drop in temperature, began to fuss, his soft whimpers cutting through the noise of the storm and straight into Alara's already aching heart. Her sacrifice had cost her the one small comfort she had, and now she was colder, wetter, and her baby was unhappy. A familiar wave of despair threatened to crest, but she pushed it down, focusing on the golden light of the cafe sign ahead. It was a beacon, a temporary harbor. She stumbled inside, dripping a puddle onto the linoleum floor, earning a disapproving frown from the bored teenager behind the counter. The air was warm and thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant, but to Alara, it felt like a sanctuary. She found a secluded booth in the back, slid onto the cracked vinyl seat, and immediately set about tending to Leo. She unwrapped him from the damp outer layers of the blanket, cooing softly as she checked his hands and feet, relieved to find them still warm. She took out the bottle she had so carefully protected and began to feed him, her entire world shrinking to the sight of her beautiful son, his tiny mouth working contentedly. Her own shivering was a distant tremor, a secondary concern. As long as he was safe, as long as he was fed, she could endure anything. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this simple act of feeding her child in a dingy cafe after giving away her last comfort, had set in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. Meanwhile, Julian Thorne remained on the street corner for a long time after she had vanished. The rain began to lessen, but he didn't notice. He stood there, clutching the paper cup, the tea inside long gone cold, but the memory of its warmth, the memory of her gentle, unwavering eyes, burned in his mind. He finally looked down at his hand, at the simple offering, and a single hot tear, the first he had shed in a year, traced a path through the cold rain on his cheek. Felt like a crack in a dam. He walked back to where his sleek, black car was parked, the driver waiting patiently, his expression carefully neutral. Julian slid into the plush leather of the back seat, the door closing with a soft, expensive click that sealed him back into his world of sterile silence and cavernous luxury. He placed the empty cup on the seat beside him as if it were a priceless diamond. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of his employer, the formidable Julian Thorne, soaked to the skin and looking utterly shattered, but with a strange new light flickering in his hollow eyes. Julian didn't speak a word on the drive back to his stately mansion on the hill. His mind was a whirlwind. For a year he had existed in a heavy fog of grief, a monochrome world where every day was the same shade of gray. His work was an automaton's routine, his interactions with people were scripted and cold. He had built walls of ice around his heart, convinced it was the only way to survive the fire of his loss. But this woman, this stranger, had walked right through them. She hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't tried to impress him or get something from him. She had simply seen a person in pain and offered what little she had. The purity of the act was a revelation. It was a testament to a kind of goodness he had forgotten existed, a goodness he thought had died with his wife, Amelia. He arrived at his cavernous home, a masterpiece of modern architecture that felt more like a museum than a living space. The polished marble floors echoed his lonely footsteps. The vast, high-ceiling living room was filled with priceless art, but it was all cold and lifeless. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the glittering, rain-washed city. He had everything a man could want, all the power and wealth in the world, yet he was utterly, desperately poor in the ways that mattered. This woman, with her worn clothes and her single suitcase, possessed a richness of spirit that dwarfed his entire empire. A new feeling began to smolder within him, displacing the cold ash of his grief. It was a renewed purpose. He had to find her. He had to know her name. He had to repay her kindness, not as a transaction, but as an act of profound gratitude. He had to ensure that a light so pure was not extinguished by the cruelty of the world. It became an obsession, a sudden, all-consuming need that was the first thing he had truly felt in a year. He turned from the window, his jaw set with a commanding resolve that had built his fortune. He strode to his office, the empty cup still in his hand, and picked up the phone. He called the head of his security team, a man known for his ability to find anyone, anywhere. "I need you to find someone," Julian said, his voice low but charged with an intensity that made the man on the other end of the line sit up straight. "She was on the corner of Elm and 6th, about an hour ago. She has dark hair, and she was carrying a baby." He paused, looking at the cup. "She gave me this." His voice cracked. The search began immediately. Julian Thorne's resources were vast, almost limitless, and he brought them all to bear on this single, desperate quest. His head of security, a former intelligence officer named Harris, treated the directive with the gravity of a national security threat. The city's network of CCTV cameras was accessed, algorithms cross-referencing facial recognition data with public records. It was an invasion of privacy on a colossal scale, a deployment of power that Julian had previously used only for hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. Now, he was using it to find a single, anonymous woman who had shown him a moment of grace. Harris's team worked through the night, tracing the woman's path from the corner of Elm and 6th. They followed her digital ghost to the 24-hour cafe, then to a temporary overnight shelter in a church basement. The following morning, they tracked her to a rundown apartment building, the same one from which she had just been evicted. It didn't take long to piece together her story. Her name was Alara Vance. Her husband, Mark Vance, a decorated firefighter, had died in a warehouse fire. She had lost her job. She had a son, Leo, 6 months old. She had no family, no support system, and was on the brink of homelessness. The report landed on Julian's desk the next afternoon, a thin file that contained the sum of a life of quiet, dignified desperation. Reading it, Julian felt a cold fury mix with the awe he already felt for her. The world had taken everything from this woman, and still, she had found it in her heart to give. He looked at the details of her eviction, the callousness of the landlord, the sheer precarity of her existence. The protective instinct that had roared to life in the rain now became a focused, strategic mission. He would not just repay her. He would become her unseen guardian, her hidden savior. His first act was swift and invisible. A phone call was made from a high-powered law firm representing a philanthropic trust. The landlord of Alara's building received a call informing him that an audit had revealed a significant clerical error regarding the Vance tenancy. Her lease was not, in fact, terminated. Furthermore, an anonymous donor had paid her rent in full for the next 2 years. The landlord, bewildered and intimidated, could only stammer his apologies. When Alara, having spent a miserable night at the shelter, returned to the apartment to retrieve a forgotten baby rattle, she found the landlord waiting for her, his face a mask of forced contrition. He handed her the keys, muttering about a mix-up, an error in the system. Alara was stunned, her mind struggling to process the sudden reversal of fortune. She accepted the keys in a daze, her relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting from her chest. She couldn't understand it. Felt like a miracle. That evening, another miracle arrived. A delivery truck pulled up outside her building. The men who came to her door brought boxes. Not the cheap cardboard of moving, but crisp, new packages. There were boxes of diapers, formula, and high-quality baby food. There were boxes of fresh produce, organic groceries, and pantry staples. And there was one large, flat box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a thick, cashmere blanket, the color of cream, so soft it felt like a cloud. A small, unsigned note was attached. It simply read, "For your warmth." Alara's hand trembled as she touched the fabric. She thought of the cold, steaming cup of tea she had given away. She thought of the man in the rain. Couldn't be, could it? The idea was too fantastical, too much like a fairy tale. She dismissed it as a coincidence, a blessing from a universe that had finally decided to show her a sliver of mercy. She attributed it to a church charity or a mistaken delivery. Yet, a small, persistent thought lingered. She wrapped the new blanket around a sleeping Leo, its luxurious warmth a stark contrast to the threadbare reality of the room. It was a blanket of safety, a tangible symbol of an unseen kindness that had entered her life. From his stark, minimalist office high above the city, Julian watched her through a discreetly placed surveillance feed, a measure that pricked at his conscience, but one he deemed necessary to ensure her safety. He watched her confusion, her relief, her gratitude. He watched her wrap the blanket around her son, and for the first time in a year, a genuine, unforced smile touched his lips. It was a quiet, secret intervention, a way for him to restore the balance, to pour some of the world's light back into her life without revealing the immense, world-altering power he wielded. He was her guardian angel, watching from a gleaming tower of glass and steel, his heart slowly, carefully, beginning to heal. Julian knew that anonymous gifts and financial security were not enough. They were a bandage, not a cure for the loneliness he saw in her eyes, a loneliness that mirrored his own. He was drawn to her, not just by gratitude, but by a powerful, undeniable connection he felt in that one brief moment in the rain. He needed to see her again, to speak with her not as a hidden benefactor but as a person. Orchestrating it was simple. Harris's team had noted that Alara took Leo to a small, quiet park every afternoon, a little patch of green tucked away from the city's hustle. Julian began to go there too. For a week, he just watched from a distance, sitting on a bench on the opposite side of the park, a book unread in his hands. He observed her gentle patience with Leo, the soft way she would sing to him, the sad, faraway look that would sometimes cross her face when she thought no one was watching. He was learning the rhythms of her quiet life, the geography of her gentle heart. He felt like a student, and she was teaching him how to feel again. Finally, he worked up the courage to approach. He chose his disguise carefully. Not the commanding CEO in a power suit, but a man dressed in simple, well-worn jeans and a soft gray sweater. He looked approachable, ordinary. In his hand, he clutched a small silver object. A child's rattle, its surface worn smooth with time. It had been his daughter Lily's. It was his own sacred relic. He walked towards the bench where she was sitting, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the park. His heart, the same heart that never beat faster when closing a billion-dollar deal, was pounding in his chest. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet. "Is this seat taken?" Alara looked up, and her eyes widened in recognition. It was him, the man from the rain. He looked different now, rested, warmer, the raw agony in his eyes replaced by a deep, settled sadness. "No, of course not," she said, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. She remembered him vividly. He sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. An awkward, yet comfortable, silence settled over them, punctuated by the happy gurgles of Leo, who was batting at a leaf. "I never got to thank you," Julian began, his voice low. "For the other night. For the tea." He looked at her directly, and his gaze was so full of sincere gratitude that she had to look away for a second. "It was nothing," she murmured. "You looked like you needed it." "It wasn't nothing," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "It was everything." He held up the silver rattle in his hand. "I was standing on that corner because it was the anniversary of my wife and daughter's death. They were killed in an accident. Right there the confession hung in the air between them, raw and unadorned." Alara gasped softly, her heart clenching in immediate, profound empathy. Now she understood the hollow emptiness she had seen in his eyes. She understood his pain, for it was a version of her own. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words heartfelt and genuine. "My husband, he was a firefighter. He died in the line of duty 8 months ago." It was her turn to confess, to share the source of her own quiet sorrow. And just like that, the barrier between two strangers dissolved, replaced by the sacred, unspoken bond of shared grief. They were two survivors, two souls adrift on the same ocean of loss. He looked at Leo, a tender expression on his face. "He's beautiful. What's his name?" "Leo," she said, a soft smile touching her lips. "He looks just like his father." Julian nodded, a ghost of a smile on his own face as he looked at the rattle. "This was my Lily's." She was almost his age, he didn't need to say more. In that moment, they were no longer a powerful CEO and a desperate single mother. They were just two people, Julian and Alara, finding a fragile solace in a shared tragedy. They talked for over an hour as the amber hue of the setting sun bathed the park in a soft, forgiving light. He didn't mention his wealth or his company. He spoke of Amelia, of her laughter, of their dreams. She spoke of Mark, of his courage, of the future they had planned. It was a conversation free of platitudes, a simple, honest exchange of memories and sorrow. He listened with an unwavering intensity that made Alara feel truly seen for the first time in months. He didn't offer advice or empty comforts. He simply listened, his steady presence a quiet anchor. When it was time for her to go, as the air grew cooler, Julian stood up. "I hope this isn't too forward," he said, "but would you let me buy you a coffee sometime? Just to talk again." Alara hesitated for only a second. There was something so sincere, so gentle about this man. She felt a connection, a spark of warmth she thought had been extinguished forever. "I'd like that," she said, and her smile was genuine, reaching her eyes for the first time in a very long time. As she walked home, a strange feeling of hope, fragile but real, blossomed in her chest. She still didn't know who he truly was, but she knew he was kind. She knew he understood. For now, that was more than enough. He hadn't just been saved by her kindness. He was, in his own quiet way, beginning to save her right back. The next few weeks were a gentle unfolding. Julian, who now insisted she call him by his first name, became a quiet fixture in her and Leo's life. They met for coffee, for walks in the park, for quiet conversations on benches while Leo slept in his stroller. Alara found herself looking forward to their meetings with an eagerness that surprised her. With Julian, she could be herself. She could talk about Mark without fear of judgment, and she could laugh without feeling guilty. He had a quiet, steady presence that calmed the anxiety that had been her constant companion for so long. He never spoke of his work, only saying he was in investments, a vague term that she accepted without question. To her, he was just Julian, a kind, sad man who was slowly finding his way back to the world, just as she was. She had no idea that between their meetings, he was a commanding force of industry, or that the clerical errors and anonymous donations that had stabilized her life were his doing. She attributed her good fortune to a turn of the cosmic tide, a reward for her suffering. The truth was far more deliberate. For Julian, these moments with Alara and Leo were his lifeline. They were pulling him from the wreckage of his past. The sterile silence of his mansion was slowly being filled with the memory of her voice, of Leo's happy gurgles. He was starting to live again, not just exist. He was falling in love, a feeling so potent and terrifying that he kept it carefully hidden behind his gentle demeanor. He wanted to tell her everything, but he was afraid of overwhelming her, of changing the pure, honest connection they had built. He wanted her to trust him as Julian, the man, not Julian Thorne, the CEO. The day of the climax arrived unexpectedly, a sudden storm on a clear day. Alara, feeling more confident and hopeful than she had in a year, had agreed to meet Julian at a bright, bustling cafe downtown. Felt like a real date. She had even bought a new blouse from a secondhand store, a soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes. She was sitting at a small table by the window, Leo cooing in his high chair beside her, when the cafe door opened and a chillingly familiar figure walked in. It was Mrs. Albright, Mark's mother. Her face, which had once been kind, was now a tight mask of cold fury. Her eyes, which used to look at Alara with affection, now glittered with a hard, accusatory light. She strode directly to Alara's table, her expensive heels clicking ominously on the tile floor. "So, this is where you've been hiding," Mrs. Albright hissed, her voice low and venomous. The cheerful chatter of the cafe seemed to dim around them. "Spending my son's memory in fancy cafes, are we?" Alara flinched as if struck. "Eleanor, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't do this here," Mrs. Albright laughed. A short, ugly sound. "Don't do this? You're the one who has been ignoring my calls. You're an unfit mother, Alara. You couldn't keep my son safe, and you certainly can't raise his child in poverty and filth." The accusation, so public and so cruel, stole the air from Alara's lungs. Heads were turning. People were whispering. Alara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, even though she had done nothing wrong. She remained dignified, her back straight, her hand protectively on Leo's high chair. "That's not true, and you know it," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I am a good mother to Leo." "A good mother?" Mrs. Albright's voice rose to a shrill cry. "You were evicted. You were living in a shelter. If it weren't for my lawyers keeping tabs on you, I wouldn't have known how far you'd fallen. You are not fit to raise a Vance. I'm taking the boy." With a sudden, swift movement, she reached for Leo. Alara gasped, moving instantly to shield her son, her body becoming a physical barrier. "No, you can't," she cried, her quiet resolve splintering into raw panic. She was overwhelmed, cornered, and her worst nightmare was unfolding in front of a room full of strangers. Just as Mrs. Albright's hand was about to close on Leo's arm, a calm but commanding voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough." The cafe door had opened again, and Julian Thorne was standing there. He wasn't the gentle, quiet Julian from the park. He was an entirely different man. He wore an impeccably tailored suit of dark charcoal gray, and he radiated an aura of absolute power and authority that silenced the entire room. His face was cold, his blue eyes like chips of ice, and they were fixed on Mrs. Albright with an expression of utter contempt. He moved with a sleek, predatory grace, crossing the room in a few long strides to stand beside Alara's table, placing a firm, protective hand on her shoulder. Alara looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and shock. Mrs. Albright faltered, momentarily taken aback by this imposing stranger. "And who are you?" she demanded, though her voice had lost its conviction. Julian didn't look at her. He looked at Alara, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. Then, he turned his full, icy attention back to Mrs. Albright. "My name is Julian Thorne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent cafe. "And I suggest you remove your hand from this child and take a step back." A ripple of recognition went through the room. Julian Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Industries, the most powerful, reclusive, and influential man in the city. Mrs. Albright's face went pale. I don't understand," she stammered. "This is a family matter." "It became my matter," Julian stated, his voice dangerously level. "The moment you chose to publicly humiliate and threaten a woman who is under my protection. A woman whose character is more pure and whose heart is more decent than anyone I have ever known. You speak of her poverty, but you are blind to her wealth of spirit. You accuse her of being an unfit mother, when she is the very definition of selfless love." His monologue was delivered with a chilling precision that left no room for argument. He then looked around the room at the gawking patrons. "And for the rest of you, I hope you're proud of yourselves for watching this spectacle." He turned back to a speechless Mrs. Albright. "Alara Vance and her son will want for nothing for the rest of their lives. Any further attempts to contact or harass them will be met with the full and undivided force of my legal and personal resources. I assure you, that is a war you cannot win." He pulled out his phone, pressed a single button, and said, "Harris, we're at the Bluebird Cafe. We have a situation that needs to be escorted from the premises too large." Discreet men in dark suits entered the cafe almost instantly. They moved silently to flank Mrs. Albright. Her face had crumbled into a mask of disbelief and utter defeat. The power dynamic had not just been reversed, it had been annihilated. She was escorted out, speechless and humiliated, leaving a stunned and silent cafe in her wake. Julian knelt beside Alara, his entire demeanor softening once more. "It's over," he whispered, his hand still a warm, steady presence on her shoulder. "You're safe." Alara just stared at him, her mind reeling, trying to reconcile the gentle man from the park with the commanding titan who had just saved her. He had saved her. The aftermath of the confrontation in the cafe was a blur of motion and emotion for Alara. Julian, with a quiet efficiency that was both breathtaking and terrifying, handled everything. He paid the bill, spoke a few low words to the stunned manager, and then gently guided Alara and a now wailing Leo out of the cafe and toward a sleek, black car that seemed to materialize at the curb. The chauffeur held the door open, his face impassive. Alara felt as though she had stepped into a different reality. The worn fabric of her life had been ripped away, revealing something gleaming and incomprehensible beneath. She sat on the plush leather seat, her mind a whirlwind of questions and disbelief. Julian slid in beside her, his presence filling the space. He didn't speak at first, simply handing her a fresh, warm bottle for Leo that the driver had apparently procured. The simple, thoughtful gesture was so at odds with the immense power he had just displayed. It was a gesture from Julian, her Julian, the man from the park. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and began to soothe her son. The car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently through the city streets. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Home," he said simply. But they didn't drive toward her small, run-down apartment building. They drove to a part of the city she had only ever seen in magazines, a neighborhood of stately brownstones and quiet, tree-lined streets. The car stopped in front of a particularly beautiful townhouse, its windows glowing with a warm, welcoming light. "Julian, I don't understand," she said, her heart thudding wildly. "This isn't my home." He turned to her, his blue eyes filled with a tender, vulnerable light she had never seen before. "I hope it will be," he said, He led her up the steps and opened the front door. The inside was not a cold, sterile mansion like the one he lived in. It was a home. It was warm, beautifully furnished, and filled with a sense of peace. The living room had a comfortable sofa, shelves filled with books, and in the corner, a brand-new, top-of-the-line crib. A nursery, fully stocked and decorated in soft yellows and greens, was waiting upstairs. A kitchen, gleaming and modern, had a refrigerator filled with food. He had prepared all of this for them. After I found you, after I learned about your situation, he began, his voice thick with emotion, I couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand the thought of you and Leo suffering while I had so much. That first night when you gave me your tea, Alara, you have no idea what you did for me. You reached into a darkness so profound I thought I'd never escape it, and you pulled me out. You reminded me that there was still goodness and light in the world. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. I started by just wanting to make sure you were safe. Paying your rent, sending groceries. I know I should have told you, but I was afraid. I was afraid of scaring you off, of cheapening the connection we had by throwing money at it. I just wanted you to know me. Just Julian. Tears welled in Alara's eyes as the pieces finally clicked into place. The clerical error, the anonymous gifts, the warm blanket. It was all him. It was an overwhelming, cathartic flood of understanding. He had been her guardian angel all along. But this is too much, she stammered, gesturing around the beautiful home. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, he said, and now he took her hands in his. They were warm and strong. I have to do this because in these past few weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength, your grace, your incredible heart, I've fallen in love with you, Alara. It's a raw, undeniable, and profound love that has healed me in ways I never thought possible. His confession hung in the air, more shocking and more wonderful than the revelation of his wealth. He loved her. I love you, he repeated, his voice cracking with the sheer force of his emotion. And I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you and Leo, cherishing you, and being the man you both deserve. If you'll let me. Alara looked from his earnest, hopeful face to her son, now sleeping peacefully in her arms, and back again. The despair that had been her constant companion for so long had vanished, burned away by the radiant warmth of his confession. In its place was a feeling she thought she would never experience again. A deep, profound sense of hope and security. Tears streamed down her face now, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of catharsis, of disbelief, of a joy so immense it was almost painful. She didn't have to say a word. She simply rose on her toes and kissed him. A kiss that was a promise, an acceptance, and a beginning. He wrapped his arms around her and Leo, holding his new family close. They were home. 1 year later. The sound that filled the air was not the pounding rain of despair, but the soft, happy music of wind chimes and a child's unrestrained laughter. The light was not the flickering, uncertain glow of a single lamp, but the brilliant, golden sunlight of a perfect summer afternoon, pouring down into a lush, sprawling garden. Alara was sitting on a soft blanket spread across the green lawn, a book open but forgotten in her lap. She was radiant, the hollow, haunted look in her eyes replaced by a deep, shimmering contentment. The threadbare sweater was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant sundress. A little boy with a head of dark curls, now a confident toddler, ran across the grass, his unsteady legs carrying him on a determined path toward a butterfly. It was Leo. He stumbled and fell onto the soft grass, but he didn't cry. He just giggled and rolled over, looking up at the blue sky. Julian emerged from the French doors of the stately but warm house behind them. He was no longer the cold statue of grief from the street corner, nor the commanding titan from the cafe. He was simply a man in love, his face relaxed and filled with a warmth that seemed to emanate from his very soul. He knelt on the blanket beside Alara, his eyes following Leo with a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. He had legally adopted Leo, giving him the Thorn name but always honoring the memory of the heroic father he had lost. He has your spirit, Julian said softly, his hand finding Alara's. An unstoppable force, Alara leaned her head on his shoulder. A comfortable, practiced gesture. "He has Mark's courage," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "And he has your kind heart." There was no sadness in her mention of Mark, only a gentle, loving reverence. Julian had created a space where her past was not something to be erased, but something to be honored. He understood that their new life was not a replacement for what they had lost, but a beautiful, unexpected chapter built upon the foundations of their memories. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a gleaming gold locket. "I had this made for you," he said. Alara took it, her fingers tracing the intricate design. She opened the clasp. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, perfect photograph of her and Mark, smiling on their wedding day. On the other side were two pictures. A smiling portrait of Julian's late wife, Amelia, holding their baby daughter, Lily, and a new picture, taken just last week, of Julian, Alara, and Leo, laughing together in this very garden. "So we can carry them all with us?" Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our pasts and our future." Altogether, a single, happy tear traced a path down Alara's cheek. It was the most thoughtful, most profound gift she had ever received. It was a symbol of their shared journey, from the depths of unbearable grief to this perfect, sun-drenched moment. He had not just given her a life of security and wealth. He had given her a life of emotional healing, of deep understanding, and of a love that was big enough to hold all their joys and all their sorrows. She closed the locket, the metal warm against her skin. Leo, having abandoned his butterfly chase, toddled over to them and collapsed into Julian's lap, his small hand reaching up to touch the locket. Julian wrapped his arms around both Alara and his son, holding them close. In the quiet of the garden, surrounded by sunlight and love, the three of them were a perfect, complete picture of a family reborn. They were a testament to the undeniable power of a single, selfless act of kindness in the rain. This story is a testament to the idea that the purest light is often found in the deepest darkness. It shows us that a single act of kindness, no matter how small, can be a seismic event, capable of cracking the coldest heart and altering the course of a life. Alara, who had lost everything, still possessed the one thing that truly mattered: a selfless heart. Julian, who had everything, was impoverished by a grief that no amount of wealth could cure. It was her spiritual wealth that saved his soul, and his material wealth that saved her life. Their story is a fable for our times, a reminder that we are all connected, and that the simple human gesture of offering warmth to a stranger can ripple outwards, creating waves of love and redemption that we can never foresee. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in the power of second chances and the profound impact of a single kind act, then we hope you'll continue this journey with us. Every one of us has the capacity to be both the virtuous sufferer and the hidden savior at different points in our lives. Sometimes we are the one in the rain, and sometimes we are the one holding the umbrella. The true magic lies in recognizing which role we are meant to play and acting with a pure and open heart, without expectation of reward. For more soul-stirring tales of love, loss, and miraculous redemption, please be sure to like this video, share it with someone who might need a story of hope, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. Your support allows us to continue bringing these inspiring stories to you. We'll see you in the next one.